Mohammed, let's go straight there. The challenge for this Fed chair at this annual Fed get-together, how big is it?
It's huge, John, and good morning. It's huge because he's speaking to multiple audiences, as you pointed out, but it's also huge because he's got to deal with issues with respect to the past, the present, and the future. He's got to figure out how he's going to address his speech last year that proved so off the mark. He's got to figure out what to signal about current monetary policy. And let's not forget that we have a framework that is not fit for purpose. We have a policy framework fit for a world of deficient aggregate demand, and we are in a world for deficient aggregate supply. So put all this together, the challenge is very big, John.
Mohammed, you're focused on a new word, stickiness. And you've been focused on that for a number of months now. From the incoming information, how sticky do you think that inflation dynamic is? And how much does that tell you about how much work this chairman still has to do?
So I worry that core inflation is going to prove more sticky than the Fed anticipates right now. We have wages are starting to be a driver of higher costs and eventually higher prices. So while headline inflation is going to continue to go down for the next 2 months, core may prove quite sticky, and that's a real problem for them.
Mm-hmm. For those of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, you just saw a little bit of light going out. That was one of the grizzly bears standing up and getting in the way of the light here. They're watching here this morning as well. Dr. Alarian, people forget why you are Dr. Alarian, and it has to do with the acuity and concision of your game theory. You codified in the modern day the phrase T decision. Let's distill that down to the T decision that Chairman Powell has to make between now and a data-busy September.
And it's an important one, Tom, because right now the Fed is so late that it's looking at two challenges. It's looking at putting the inflation genie back into the bottle, and it's looking at not creating too much damage to economic growth and inequality, something that you have been speaking to all morning. Look, I don't think he has any choice. He's got to put the inflation genie back into the bottle. You know, there's an old saying that macro stability isn't everything, but without it, you have nothing. So they've got to put that inflation genie back into the bottle and do it in a determined and sustainable fashion.
Okay. But this is the politics of it, Dr. Alarian. If you have a partial differentiation from 8% U.S. inflation, the haves are benefited when you get to 6% or 5%. The have-nots, the great middle class, are still flat on their back. What is your timeline where all of America finally gets inflation back into the bottle?
So it's going to take some time because the Fed has been asleep at the wheel, and that's unfortunate. Tom, what you raise is much bigger. It speaks to the Fed being necessary but not sufficient to address our policy issues. You've got to deal with the inequality aspect. You've got to protect the most vulnerable segments of the population with focused fiscal policy. And you've got to do a lot more on productivity and equal opportunity. So it's a long list, but the Fed has to focus on inflation and has to do it in a more committed fashion than it's done it so far.
So it's been trying to sound, Mohammed, committed, right? I mean, they've basically been saying inflation is their -- 1 issue that they're facing. Why is the market not hearing it?
Two reasons, Lisa. One is the Fed itself. Let's not forget that Chair Powell stated that we were at the neutral rate. The minute the market heard that, it moved, and it moved in a significant fashion, and all the talk about pivot started being amplified. So that's one reason that the communication hasn't been consistent, and that's been a problem for the last year. And the second issue is that the market is looking at the impact on growth, is looking at the potential impact on markets, and as John said earlier today, remembers the fourth quarter of 2018, remembers the Fed blinking, so it believes when push comes to shove, the Fed is going to blink again, that we're going to have a flip-flopping Fed.
Mohammed, what I hear from you is that you don't think this Fed blinks anytime soon.
I don't know, John. I know what they should do, which is they should not blink. But it's been very difficult to call this Fed. This Fed has unfortunately failed at analysis, failed at forecast, failed at communication. So it's very difficult to say what this Fed is going to do. It's easier to say what it should do, but it's much harder to say what it's going to do. And that's why you get this disconnect that you've been talking about between the markets and the Fed.
Easier to find out what you think. So let's go there and wrap up this segment with you on what you think. Larry Summers called that neutral comment analytically indefensible. You said on neutral, and I think you were a little bit more diplomatic about it when we last spoke, you said the zip code for neutral was higher than where we are right now. Mohammed, what is the zip code for neutral, and how on earth do we know with inflation where it is and where rates where they are right now?
So I don't know specifically where it is, and I've been warning against spurious precision. There are so many structural changes going on. We are changing liquidity regimes. I said earlier, we're going from a world of deficient aggregate demand to a world of deficient aggregate supply. That's the world we live in now. No one knows for sure where neutral is. So you've got to try to figure out as you go along the way. And you mustn't attempt this spurious precision, because if you do, the market is going to jump immediately to conclusions, and then you're going to have to undo it. You know, the Fed itself, Fed officials have walked back that comment. It didn't take many days for other Fed officials to come out and say, we're not at neutral.